I'm Tom Hall. I'm the artistic director and co-head at Montclair Film. I'm so grateful that you're all here supporting the Montclair Public Library, especially in these times when libraries need all of our support and presence and attendance at events. It's really great to see you all here tonight as we talk about Unscripted. Before we get started, can I ask for a show of hands? How many of you have already read Unscripted? Okay, so a small group. For those of you who have not read it already, there are copies available in the library's lobby. Afterward, there's going to be a book sale and signing. Having been gifted a copy of this book, I'm telling you right now, you're going to want to pick up a copy of this book and read it. It sat next to my bedside tables for literally one night because I devoured it. It's an incredible read, not at all what I was expecting when I was invited to do this talk tonight, but I'm so honored to be here with these two esteemed writers to talk about this book, and I feel weird being in the middle because I'm like on a swivel, but I'm going to go with it. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start talking a little bit about your process. A couple of things that people may not know, I for one don't really know the answer to, is as journalists, you came to these stories individually, separately from one another, decided to join forces to write this book together, but your journalism is sort of the foundational moment for the book itself. Maybe, Jim, you could start, and then Rachel, you could talk a little bit about your coming to the story, finding it, and then making the decision to come together to tell the story in this book.
You're right. I mean, this story has been cited as a reason why we should all be working back in the office instead of being at home. I was in the newsroom one day, and I had a desk by the aisle, and it was late one evening, and I was kind of like working there, and I saw these cowboy boots standing in the aisle, and then I looked up and it was Rachel. She had her coat on, she was about to leave. I'll always remember that moment. And she said, "Are you working on something about Les Moonves and the CBS board and charges of sexual harassment?" I said, "Yeah, I am." She said, "Well, I think I'm working on something that's quite similar, and I wonder if there might be some overlap, or we could, collaborate on this." And she told me a little bit about it, and I'll let her tell that part. But I immediately said, "Oh my God, yes, we are totally pursuing, the same story here." And that was the beginning of this. But I don't think I ever met you. I saw you in the newsroom from a distance, but I'm not sure I even knew your name, to be honest. And it's one of the strange twists of fate that happen in life sometimes, is all, make the journalistic mistake of telling you the ending before, but the collaboration has been fantastic. I mean, it's been, somebody I didn't even know, and in the middle of this, I kind of thought it would be like marrying somebody after one date, or just seeing one. But we got along great, and it was a wonderful collaboration. But tell us more about the source that got you.
Oh, yes.
Very very close to the audio, so push your mic a little closer to you.
I'm so sorry. So very loud. Is this any better?
Hello. Oh, there I am. Hi.
Is this okay? Can you guys, it's not too loud now? Okay. Yeah, it's with my hair. My hair always just runs into the microphone. So we can actually, it's so nice because when Jim and I were doing most of the promotion for this book, one of our most important sources had not come out publicly and talked about who she was, so we had to kind of dance around it in talks like this, but it's nice to actually be able to give the full story. There was basically what had happened was, this was the height of Me Too, and CBS had just ousted its chief executive, Les Moonves, and had hired 2 law firms to conduct an investigation into his behavior. And a young lawyer at one of the law firms had seen some articles an article that I had done about how that investigation was going, and she reached out to me and she said, look, it was kind of a confusing message. It was sort of like, I have faith in the investigation, but I don't really want to be one of the bad guys. If my law firm is doing bad things, I want you to have my number. That was kind of the gist of it. It was sort of it was not quite clear what this person wanted except to be on the right side of history at this huge moment. And immediately, it was very clear that this would be a person who would be in a position to give us a treasure trove of information. And an editor had suggested that Jim, who had gotten a tip about the investigation, that Jim and I could work together. And Jim, as you all know, is one of my most esteemed colleagues. He had written 10 books before this, and I was actually a little bit nervous to stop and say, hi, I have this person, is it any interest, maybe, because you never know with reporting, it's such a, forgive my language, it's such a crapshoot sometimes. You talk to all kinds of different people, so many people who seem promising or promise you things. You never know what's going to turn up, and you certainly don't want to. I'm always very conscious of you don't want to waste other people's time, particularly not esteemed colleagues' time with, I have a person who might be able to get us stuff. And Jim was so, when I stopped by his desk and I said, I have this person, you were so encouraging. You're like, yeah, that really does sound like somebody that you should definitely go to. She was living in Washington, D.C., and you should definitely get on the train, you should definitely meet her. I thought, okay, I should, if Jim thinks so, I should definitely try to go. And so I booked a train out there, and this woman turned out to be the treasure trove that we had hoped, and she provided Jim had a lot of the material that she was able to confirm, and she added new material, and she was able to really provide some of the backbone source material for our first stories that inspired the book idea.
And you had been working on Me Too related stories, which were also a very collaborative process. I mean, a lot of journalists were working on some similar stories with similar subjects, and I'm assuming sharing information and but it was also competitive. One of the things that comes through in the book is there's this sort of ticking clock of other journalists figuring out the same things are happening. Ronan Farrow features in the book, especially as it relates to Me Too. I'm wondering how that impacted your decision to work together on this and sort of combine forces. Was there this sort of competing, this is going to get out, we want to be first? Is that still a driver for you guys at the beginning stages of the story?
At that point, and Jim, I don't want to take this question, but at that point, if I'm not mistaken, Ronan Farrow had already broken big stories about Moonves. He had already broken that 12 women had come forward and accused him of various levels of misconduct. And Moonves had already left CBS, but Jim had gotten a tip that Moonves' ouster had nothing to do with Ronan Farrow's stories, which were excellent. He did excellent work. We do not mean to diminish that, but Jim had a tip that it was actually because of an as of yet a woman who is not public, who basically had an accusation against Moonves that Moonves was trying to keep quiet. And I don't remember, Jim, if you
Yeah, that was I was originally pursuing the story based on a tip that there was another actress named Bobby Phillips who had been assaulted by Moonves, and it was his subsequent attempts to silence her, and her manager was essentially blackmailing Moonves, and he was getting into it. I'm not going to give away too much of the story to tell you that the manager was trying to get her new jobs acting in CBS shows, of which he would then take a cut of the salary, and Moonves was, in fact, rustling up parts for her. So he was succumbing to this extortion, essentially, in order to keep her quiet. Now, none of that had become public. And this was actually, so you had experience dealing with sort of Me Too allegations. I had nothing. I'd never done any of this sort of thing. But I did end up, for that story, after a long campaign to get her to talk, interviewing Bobby Phillips. And that was the first time I realized how hard it is for women who have experienced this to come forward. And by the way, the Times had gotten tips about Les Moonves very early on, and they had gotten a tip about her, remember? And they had tried to track her down, and she had, not wanted to come forward, didn't respond, didn't answer phone calls. So that had gone nowhere. But then you brought a lot of expertise in terms of expanding this when we went on into a book. There were, of course, many other victims of Moonves, and you had a lot of experience interviewing victims. And I think, as you can see in the book, they have some very compelling stories, and you were responsible for getting them to really open up about that. And I think that is really a credit to you. And I think in some ways it was a good partnership, that I was older and male, and you were younger and female, and that appealed to certain different characters in different ways. So that was very helpful.
So we definitely played to our strengths. There were a lot of people that were not going to take my call that would have taken Jim's call, and there were people that were going to be more comfortable talking to me, perhaps. So it was really complimentary.
I want to come back to Bobby's manager later, because that is the lowest rent blackmail of all time. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. Marv. Don't forget Marvin in the book, he's an unbelievable character.
He is,
Um,
but he's all too believable.
Yes, I mean, I work in the film business there, I'm very aware of the Marvins of the world. It's like, yeah, it's a,
They're the people we never read about in the, the glossies.
that's right. Grinding for a living on the margins of the business. But I wanted to go back a little bit further than that part of the story, talk a little bit about the Sumner Redstone story, which is the first sort of half of the book. The book's divided into two parts that are interrelated by Sherry Redstone's interaction with both parties and Les Moonves' position in Sumner Redstone's company. But they're very different in terms of the approach. If the Les Moonves story is a Me Too story, the Sumner Redstone story is straight out of, like, I don't know, Succession meets seems elder abuse or something. I don't know how they explain it, but it's an insane story about a billionaire. And I'm wondering how you took what you had with Les Moonves and found your way to Sumner Redstone and made that move, because it worked. And then reversing the structure, right? Because the Sumner Redstone material comes first in the book.
Yes, there's part of the story behind that. Should I start?
Yes, please, yeah.
You've heard me tell this story, but so we published a story that focused on the triangle of Bobby Phillips, the actress, Moonves, the CBS head, and the manager. That ran in the Times. We knew there was a lot more material, thanks to this confidential source, about the CBS board and how they responded, and that was how we originally thought of the book. In the course of working on this, the first thing that we got was from some other sources. They gave us copies of the affidavits from the nurses and household staff that had been working in the Sumner Redstone mansion that no one had seen. And when I read those, I realized, oh my God, the Moonves stuff is only part of this much bigger story. And then they told this sort of incredible saga of how Sumner Redstone, the billionaire, the owner of all these companies, was living in this mansion with not one but two mistresses who were slowly but surely freezing out his family, especially his daughter Sherry, and gaining control of his money. And in an extraordinary, the details of that are astonishing. So that, I realized this is an important part of the story. At some point, we learned that the reason this little cozy trio blew up was because one of the women started having an affair with a former reality show star and soap opera star who also had gone to prison for fraud. I mean, you're the mistress of a billionaire and you decide to have an affair with a convicted felon. To this day, I do not understand this, but anyway, so he was on the fringes of people we knew would be somehow involved in the book. And so Rachel, I said, we spent about 10 seconds deciding that Rachel should be the one to interview him. So he was living in Arizona. She went out there. She started calling me over the Memorial Day weekend. First of all, I was afraid that you'd be free to go because I knew he would hit on you immediately, which happened. But I knew you could handle it. So anyway, but I said, call me like every 15 minutes. So she was calling me over the Memorial Day weekend saying, okay, he just said this, he just said that. He has all these emails, he has these documents. It was on a trove. I mean, you have to tell me more about your experience with him. But so I went to bed one night thinking, being annoyed. We'd already written like the first 100 pages of the book. And it started with the CBS boardroom meeting. And I was thinking to myself, this guy George, his name is George Pilgrim. I said, George is taking over the story. That wasn't the plan. And I woke up the next morning and I realized sometimes, sleeping on something really helps. And I said, wait a minute. Let George take over the story. George is the story. And so George is the opening scene now. And I threw out the first 100 pages. I've never done that before. It's painful, let me tell you, all that work going down the drain. But it was, I remember how I conveyed that to you.
I think it's just exactly the way you just said that. It was great. No, it was very.
But one of my favorite things to tell them is how you relate so much information.
The timeshare, is that what you're
The timeshare, yes. Tell them about the timeshare.
So George and I spent a weekend wandering around Sedona, Arizona, and he had so many records. He kept everything, and he had like a safe full of cash. He had like photos of every gift that he'd been secretly given that belonged to. Sorry, is this echoing? Is this okay? And I called Jim and I said, I gotta stay an extra day. Like we just have to figure out, I'm just gonna stay an extra day. And because it was Memorial Day weekend in Sedona, which is so expensive on a normal weekend, let alone Memorial Day, I just thought I don't want to spend like $1,000. And George said, well, there's a hotel that's probably pretty inexpensive. So he drives me to the hotel, because I've been driving around with him in the car that, by the way, Manuela had bought for him with Sumner's money. So we're driving around in Sumner's car, and he takes me to this hotel, and he comes in with me, and I go to the check-in desk, and they said, okay, well, we can book you for this night, but if you sit in on like an hour-and-a-half timeshare presentation, you can get the night for free. And I just thought, okay, well, sure, I'll do it. And George is standing next to me, he said, I'll come too. The two of us end up sitting through like an hour-and-a-half timeshare presentation where everybody keeps referring to us as like husband and wife. And at the end of it, George, like he wanted to have the follow-up, he wanted to buy the time. He was sold, and I was like, George, no, you can't, you should not buy this timeshare. We really need to leave. But we just had like the wacky. It was such a fun, interesting. It was such a really good experience, and we just kept talking that whole. Jim and I just kept talking that whole weekend because every time I called you, it was like something more unbelievable than the previous update. My favorite story with George was he had told me his wackiest story, which I won't reveal too much, but there's a very wacky story in the book that sounds unbelievable, and it involves having to have $5,000 in cash in a safe that he just has. And I just thought, okay, that's absolutely ridiculous. Like I don't believe it. The story is not true. And George lived with his parents, and so there was a USB drive that he needed to give me because it had a bunch of documentation and photographs on it that we used for the book. And so we go back to his parents' house, had a lovely chat with his mother, and he starts pulling stuff out of the safe, and he ends up pulling out 2 bags of cash with $75,000 in each one. And I still have this picture. It's me standing in front of the Sedona Mountains holding out $150,000 in cash in both hands.
But I think there was a lesson here in that, in trials, for example, George would be impeached as a witness in a matter of minutes. I mean, he was a convicted felon.
An alcoholic.
God knows what else. And he had, one of the fascinating things we discovered about him was he had impersonated being the grandson of William Randolph Hearst, which he succeeded in doing for a long time, except that he agreed to do a reality TV show in which he was William Randolph Hearst III or something like that. And the thing aired. And the Hearst family saw this giant billboard in LA promoting him as the grandson. Which, by the way, if you actually looked at when William Randolph Hearst had died, he couldn't have a grandson the age of George. But nevertheless, everybody in Hollywood had swallowed this. So they ended up suing him, and the whole show had to be taken down. So anyway, he clearly had a checkered past, to put it mildly. And yet, I discovered this into my other work. He was one of the most careful, accurate
He's so reliable.
narrators. And all these wild stories he told us, we backed up. We just couldn't take his word on everything. But he had escaped from this rehab facility without any money. That's why he had to get the money. And that story just sounded too incredible. But we tracked down all these contemporaneous witnesses who said, yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Yes, all these people that knew George were just, because they would all, yep, that's what, including, can I tell the UFO story?
Oh, yes.
So George had claimed to me, this is not in the book, but George had claimed to me that he had seen a UFO that, like, it given him it had, like, communicated with him, and it told him that he was going to meet this Sidney Holland, or somebody like Sidney Holland, and he, like, communicated. He said that the UFO had been chased by a couple fighter jets with, like, red tails, and it was at a family barbecue, and then it left. And so I just thought, this is outrageous. And then when I went to meet his mother, I said, and his mother was like she slept with a gun under her bed. She was from Oklahoma originally. She was no nonsense. She clearly thought her son was a pain in the ass. And I said, so to making conversation, I said, George told me this UFO story, the UFO appeared at the barbecue. What do you think of that? Oh, I saw that too. I don't know what it was, but yeah, I saw it. It was chased by red tails. I just thought, what? How are all these stories holding up?
Well, you can see by this point we were a long way from the George and Sydney, which starts the book, is the butterfly flapping its wings that then results in a hurricane. Because the dominoes start falling, and it's the whole pathway through which Sherry regains influence over her father, and then is able to vanquish the various people that are trying to cut her out of her family money and running the companies.
And this, I mean, it blew my mind that, like, there are people buying stocks in these companies and shareholders of these companies, and not, maybe 5 pages of business takes place in this book. The rest of it is just batshit insanity. People covering up, sorry, did I swear? Covering up sex crimes, spending all of their time and energy dealing with all of these interpersonal relationship problems that have nothing to do with the running of a company. And I've always thought, you know, personally, that there's sort of a cult of the CEO in this company, that someone gets placed in that position and they are sort of dehumanized and treated like a superhero who's going to lead the company and be this visionary person, but they're all deeply flawed, troubled people in this book. And I'm wondering if it shifted your perspective about business reporting and reporting on these guys in general, especially the Me Too movement, which really brought everything crashing down to earth, all the privilege, all of the time spent doing all this personal, you know, nefarious business that has nothing to do with the lives that they're leading as business leaders. And it's hidden from view, and millions of dollars are spent, NDAs are signed, and lawyers, and all the resources that go into protecting this behavior. I'm just wondering if it shifted your perspective on corporate culture, CEOs.
Well, this is certainly underscores some of that in very dramatic terms, but I've been covering this world for a long time, and before I went into journalism, I was working as a lawyer at a big corporate firm in New York, and so part of what led me into journalism was obviously I could never disclose the things I saw as a lawyer, but I, as a young lawyer, met CEOs of very prominent clients and saw, and by the way, we were only hired when they were in trouble, so they'd all done bad things. And I saw what was going on, really, and that's what was a great education for me. You didn't learn any of this in law school, believe me. And I would see what was really going on in these big companies, and I thought, oh my God, you know, this is horrible. It didn't, you know, and these people are incompetent. And so I've already had a somewhat skeptical view. I didn't necessarily, I mean, look, they're great CEOs, that like they're great everything, but there are also some really bad ones. And I think you're right, you know, because of the wealth and power that they wield, people assume that, you know, the CEOs have some, you know, great superpower status. But you were newer, so maybe you were not as jaded as I was.
Jim put it really well when we first started on this project. Jim said that this book is a collision of Me Too meets the boardroom. That our book is really probably the best look behind the scenes of how a company handles not just any crisis, but a crisis that is very much of our time and of this moment. And we've been saying, people ask us all the time, like, well, what do you think about, do you think this is happening in other companies? And we both feel that if this is one really deep look at one company, you can only imagine what's happening elsewhere. So it was, I certainly did not work at a law firm, and I've been a business reporter for a few years, but I had certainly never encountered this before. And another big lesson for me that was very eye-opening was what, Jim and I talked about this a lot, but what kind of a joke corporate governance can be. Like, you had all these people that at so many different stages when they should have said, you know, we need to take this allegation more seriously, or we need to hire a lawyer to investigate this. There's just nobody. It was such a clubby boys club. You know, in many different, not many, but a few different moments, you have board members saying, Les Moonves is our guy. You know, I don't care if 30 women.
They said 100.
Yeah, I don't care. Yes, I don't care how many women come forward. He's our guy. And as Jim has said many times in interviews when we talked about this, nobody's your guy. You represent shareholders, and it was just, I had never seen anything like that, and so that was really eye-opening.
It was for me too, in reading the book. And this is a public, imagine a privately held company. Like, you know, where there's no scrutiny at all. Like, you can only imagine what goes on there. So
Well, I have to admit, I was shocked by a few things. Even in my decades as a reporter, things that I've witnessed, I've never seen anything like this. But we don't have any children in the audience. So I'll just give one example. It really totally, to this day, shocks me that Les Moonves had a woman on the payroll who worked in the office of the chief executive, whose primary job was to administer oral sex to him in the office whenever he wanted it. And, you know, this is a publicly traded company who is paying her a salary. And I just thought, what? That was another thing that had never surfaced until we got the testimony from the source. We never knew anything. Who would know? But he was questioned by the lawyers, and he was the one who disclosed this. And by the way, that woman has never come forward, has never complained about this job.
And we knew who she was,
And
and
we had,
and sort of a separate, I could go down a whole long rabbit hole for this, but there are, I feel like, a lot of tough decisions to make about what, you know, when you name somebody and how much to, you know, at some point what value it is. Like that woman, presumably, no, we did not name the woman, and presumably that woman was mortified, and probably that wasn't, if she could have chosen any job at CBS, that probably was not the job. And so, that's to be funny, but yes, but yeah, no, we did know, and there were other people, by the way, there were other women in this book who still, despite how much the tides have changed and people tend to support women who come forward with credible accusations of sexual assault, there were still people who said, I'm still not going forward in your book. I don't care that he's out of power, and I don't care that maybe he's not going to sue me. There's no upside for me. You know, I don't want my children to know, or I've never told my husband, or things that, you know, that really pull on your heartstrings and are really relatable and just make you wonder, again, if this is what we uncovered for this book, you know, it just goes to show we have no idea what else is out there and who else hasn't come forward or hasn't spoken.
well, the other thing that amazed me is I always assumed, until this book, that CEOs, their schedules are incredibly tight. They're 6 in the morning, they're at the gym at 5, and they're up till midnight, and like to get a 10-minute interview with them is unbelievably difficult. So how do they have time for all these affairs? Unbelievable, including some in Redstone.
Yeah, it was
More than once at the same time.
together, and living in the same house.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was, and again, like that example, because he was the founder of the company, he's still involved. He's a major shareholder of Paramount at the time, and owned the Viacom CBS, owned the company. And so there's no mechanism to remove him, even though he's not well. He's living in this sort of insane world that he's built for himself, private world. The other thing I found interesting about it is just the sort of, you see shows like, you know, people have seen Succession with like, you're no longer going to be the CEO, oh, I fought my whole life as a kid, right? And then another kid's like, I'm going to do it. It's like, not you either. And you're like, that can't be real, that there's like a CEO who's going to make like huge billion-dollar decisions about his family, about other people, based on a sexual need or a whim on a Thursday, but then change it on Friday. And there's so much of a roller coaster with his decision-making, and he's losing his sort of mental faculties. He's being manipulated and sort of held hostage by these two women who are driving his family away and looking, ideally, to take over the shares of the company and be billionaires themselves. I mean, they're getting tens of millions of dollars in gifts and cash. Hundreds of millions of dollars in gifts and cash, as, you know, everyone's like, oh, the caretaker business at, you know, home care is so not profitable. It was incredibly profitable for these two women. It was unbelievable. So I'm just wondering, like, when, and this is a weird way to get into this question, but when you're writing a newspaper piece and you're fact-checking and doing all that work, you're putting quotes around what people say, precisely around what they say, because they're being quoted in the New York Times. This is not a series of newspaper articles. This is a book. It's a non-fiction book. Thoughts are ascribed to people. Recollections are ascribed to people in moments, feelings, emotions. You're building characters out of real people using really great non-fiction writing. In the film side, we always get questions about documentary films. And I say documentary filmmakers are artists. They're telling a story. They're using nonfiction as their canvas, but they're making editorial choices. They're giving voice to certain scenes, they're cutting things, they're clicking music. This is not, you're not watching real life on the screen, you're watching a perspective, a point of view. This book is definitely a point of view. I'm wondering how you navigate as reporters the difference between what's going in the newspaper, what we're going to save for the book, and how we get into the mindset of the subjects in a different way than you would. Is there a different muscle that you're using as nonfiction writers versus news reporting?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, when we did the article in the Times, we put everything we had in there at the time. We didn't hold something back thinking we'd do a book. So we did the article, and then we decided to do a book, and then we took a leave, and then we gained new information, and we put that in the book. But you're right, I do think you write a book differently. Newspapers, and the Times included, are very focused on attribution. Where does information come from? We put most of the attribution in the notes at the back. My own view, particularly when somebody's reading the book, they want to know what the story is, what's happening, and there's a lot of material to divulge. And if we interrupted that narrative every paragraph to say, oh, and by the way, this is the source for that, this is the source for that, if you want to read more, go here, you couldn't digest it. In a newspaper format, that's feasible. But to write in a narrative style like this, which is in many ways quite cinematic, and I taught at Columbia Journalism School for many years, and I always told my students, visualize. If this were a movie, what would you be seeing? And so, I do think that way when writing, particularly at book length. So I would say the main difference is there's not so much attribution. But we are very careful that if we said somebody is thinking something, then either they told us that or we had testimony. There were a lot of court proceedings, there were a lot of depositions, there were interrogations of the lawyers. So even people who we were not able to personally interview, we had direct quotations in which they described what they said, what they were thinking, why they did things. So we had, and that's mostly in the notes, we had very solid sources for that. We would never put words in someone's mouth or in their mind if that wasn't coming from them.
No, I just, again, something you said to me very early on is that, because this is my first book, and Jim said to me at the beginning, with a book, you have the advantage of not having to gum everything up with attribution. And I just thought, oh, it's going to be so fun. We can actually just write what happened, because, of course, you want readers to know that what you're telling is reliable, but a book has the advantage of having a note section in the back, whereas the newspaper article you have to say, according to. So that was really a pleasure. I'd never gotten the experience of being able to just tell a story narratively.
I probably shouldn't say this, but in the newspapers, you'll often see the attribution according to people familiar with what happened, which tells you absolutely nothing. Like, oh, it's according to people who weren't familiar with what happened. So how many words is that according to? Like, you could just dished up 10 words that add nothing to the reader's understanding, and yet you can't get away with it. The editors write it in. I've been fighting this battle for decades.
And how did you guys collaborate then on these moments in the book in terms of the writing process as authors? So you have, it's a unified style all the way through the book. The writing is very consistently the voice is there, but it's a collaborative process. I found that fascinating that you could come together and sort of agree on the language and the tone and the texture of the words together. How did that work between the two of you?
Jim took the lead writing the book, and we both reported, and I would send up detailed memos. And I think sometimes it can be very challenging if you have two reporters who both want to write a book. Sometimes it works great. Other times it's very challenging to meld the voices. And again, this was my first book, and Jim had written 10, and so this was a very good kind of learning experience. Jim, every step of the way, he'd say, well, this is what I'm thinking, and he'd send me what he had written, and we'd talk about it, and if I had any feedback, I'd say, well, maybe we could tweak this a little bit, but it was, I think, easier for both of us to just have one person kind of taking taking the lead. That was my take on it.
Yeah, we discussed everything, but I would write it and then hand it over to you, and you'd make changes and suggestions and revisions and get it back. But I did feel it was important, this story in particular. I mean, some people like alternate chapters or something, but I felt this was a sustained narrative that needed a common voice from the beginning to the end.
And then last question, I think we have audience questions in just a moment here, but the last question that I have for you guys is, Sherry Redstone, who's sort of the through line between the two stories that sort of brings it together. At the time that the Les Moonves allegations were being made, there was a very contentious moment at the company because there was her father sort of no longer there to guide the ship. He was in charge. She had a lot of power. There was a belief, I think, rumored belief, that this was all manufactured by her to get him out of the way so that she could take over the business. The book absolves her of that completely, as does the reporting. And I'm wondering if she has obviously read the book and cleared it. Everyone in this book is incredibly litigious as well, I should mention. Like, there isn't a character in here who hasn't sued somebody, I don't think. So there's that process that you have to navigate as well, but especially with her, who's now in charge of the company. Maybe talk a little bit about how you got her sign off on it and built her as a character in the book, as a subject in the book as well, because she comes out very magnanimously. She just wants her father back. She just wants his love. She wants to do the right thing by the company. She doesn't want to be involved, but okay, she'll be involved. But in the end, she controls the whole thing. And it was a very subtle process for her in that way, sort of a growing awareness. I couldn't tell if I believed that, just knowing what I know about how much power is available to her at the end of the rainbow, if you know what I mean? So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you guys built that character of Sherry Redstone, her process, and then navigated the litigious minefield of all of it.
You could talk about vindicating her from that charge that she manufactured all this.
The idea that she had manufactured, I aggressively pursued that. If she had actually planted these stories, that would have been an incredible story for our book. And everybody in Hollywood was convinced that she was behind the stories in the New Yorker and she was leaking things. And I was like, that is it. I'm going to confirm that if that is true. And I just spent months chasing down every lead. Somebody had heard that we're consigliere here, or a PR person, and talked to this reporter and blah, blah, and nothing panned out. And at some point I just realized, like, okay, I mean, maybe she's the world's greatest mastermind and like there's just no footprint of anything, or maybe people are just all too eager to believe that a woman is conniving and that she, and like it could be, maybe tomorrow we'll find out all the ways that she planted this, but I found it really hard to believe that I spent as much time on it and like the people that were the most convinced and just, they just knew that she had talked to it just nothing panned out. It was all vapor. So anyway, it made me think a lot about why people even were spreading that about her to begin with. That was like, I think, one of the more interesting thought exercises of reporting this.
Well, she's a good character from a narrative point of view, and from the film world, you would probably recognize this, in that she was drawn into this kind of against her will. She had a family, she wanted to have a foundation, she didn't want to get involved in the day-to-day. But with the women and the cutting her out, I mean, the thing abuse that her father was undergoing, that's a big part of the story, was sort of elder abuse. She's drawn against her will in the middle of it. And then she has to do battle with a series of forces. First the women, then the Paramount, then Les Moonves, and the CBS board. And finally, you get to the end of the story, she emerges in charge of a now much diminished asset, thanks to all the fighting that's gone on. So in that sense, I think she was an appealing character in that, I mean, of course you can never know for sure, but even you say she had a lot of money and power at the end, I don't think that's something she ever really wanted or dreamed of having. And it was, again, part of what makes this book rich to me is that it is an in-depth study of a relationship between a very wealthy, powerful, and difficult and abusive father and a daughter. And the relationship between fathers and daughters, I think, is under-scrutinized, certainly in the nonfiction world. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, pretty common. Fathers and daughters, not that much. And I think one of the we can't answer every question, but one of them to me is the very end of the book. You see the scene. We end the book with her, the scene of her at the graveyard. I don't want to give it away. But the fact, I do believe, and I witnessed this with her many times, and she cried and, was very emotional about it. She loved her father. She loved her father, and she desperately wanted his love in return. Did she ever get it? I'll let you be the judge of that. And maybe also, drawing on your own experience, this deep need of all children to have the love of their parents, and maybe particularly a daughter who wanted, above all things, the love and respect of her father.
She was very protective of his vision for the company and the assets, which ironically are now potentially up for grabs in terms of the company being sold off and the changes that have happened because of all of this to the company. Have you followed up with her at all? Are you still following Paramount?
Yes, and you asked about her. We did, she agreed in the very end of the process. Initially, I did speak to her on multiple occasions, but she did not want to be identified as a source. And then in the end, she did agree. In the notes, you'll see that she did agree to be identified as having participated in the process. And I think at that point she gained a little more confidence. She was very wary and nervous. And she'd been accused of so many bad things and been written in the press. She was very wary and defensive, but she came around. And then I heard, she didn't tell me this personally, but her spokeswoman said that she had started reading the book and it was too painful. But that the parts she did read, she thought were very fair and accurate.
Great.
So, this is the part where you guys get to ask the questions. I will say that it will take a little longer, but that's partly because this is such a complex book.
We haven't even scratched the surface.
Right, and now I'm dying to read. So I think you did your job.
Great.
Questions?
Willard Tressel, everybody.
Hello, Tom. Great book. I devoured it when it first came out. It was just terrific. Everyone get it. So when's the movie coming out? And is Paramount behind it? Tom and James, you were talking about the characters of CEOs, and Sumner Redstone just would not relinquish the throne, and he actually thought he was going to defy death, isn't it? That came through in the book.
Well, he said that repeatedly.
And
did he really believe that?
Didn't we come down and say things that, you and I think we decided that he half believed that he would never die.
Well, to me, one of the most revealing things came, I think it was out of one of the women you interviewed, who said that he confided in her, one of his girlfriends, that the reason he didn't want to die is he knew he had done many bad things in his life, and he didn't want to face a final reckoning.
He didn't want to what?
He didn't want to
He
face
did
the
not want to
final
face the
reckoning.
final reckoning. He thought he would face the final judgment if he died, and it was going to be bad. He said at one point, I'm going to hell anyway, so why should I? And it has caused me to reflect on something, which as I've gotten older, I may be naive, but I think it's true, that, what he was mistaken about is bad people don't have to wait for the final judgment. He was in his own hell already while he was still alive. Some people say they feel sorry for him, others say he got what he deserved. I'm not here to judge, but I don't want to end my life like that. For all his money and everything, he ended in a miserable position. And it does lead me to think that there is kind of a rough justice that bad people in the end get what they deserve. We'll see.
Or the Supreme Court punts it for 2 months.
Yeah, some bad people.
Loved your book. Somewhere in the book you mentioned that Shari was willing to have the 2 women walk away with like $45 million. Like it was $45. These people had so much money just floating around that they could spend as they wish. Just such an abundance. Amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the zeros just keep going out. I mean, Didn't you find that astonishing? I mean,
Jim and I have said over and over again that this book it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, that money does not buy you happiness. And one really big lesson in this book is, Sumner, by the end of his life, is isolated from his family. He's absolutely miserable. I joke and say that this book is a mix of Weekend at Bernie's and King Lear, but there were really serious elements of elder abuse in this. And the one big takeaway, my parents are still alive and they're getting older, and I'm an only child, and there are more and more reasons to visit and help. And one thing that this book really hit home was, it really, and Jim has said this also, it really matters who you surround yourself with. That's the big takeaway. It's like the relationships in your life, for all of your power and money, if you don't have good relationships, if you don't have people who love you and will help you in your vulnerable moments, then if it can happen to Sumner Redstone, it can happen to anybody, basically.
well, yeah, like one of the things we concluded was there's a downside to being a billionaire. You would think that you can surround yourself with the best of everything, the best lawyers, the best doctors, the nurses, the staff. But once you're that rich, they're all trying to get a piece of it. It's like they're not just helping you, they're trying to get their hands on some of the money. All of them maybe are trying to get, the lawyers didn't behave well in there. And being that rich hurt him, I think. It was a liability.
It made him a huge target, and because he didn't have anybody who, his daughter wanted to, but his daughter had been kicked out, and he didn't have people who were protecting him in his vulnerable years.
Thank you. I love the book, and I want to pick up on something about the lawyers. You used to cover lawyers, I know, and you were a lawyer, and you've covered a lot of corporations. What's your take on the corporate lawyers involved in this that did investigation, that were called in for Moonvis, and also that advised the boards? Did they not tap their lawyers? Did they seem to have gone missing?
Yeah, there are some really dubious behavior. The investigation, the initial investigations by the outside lawyers of Moonves were absolutely laughable. They were clearly orchestrated to exonerate him and give the board a reason to do what they wanted to do anyway, which was back him and keep him on. And I think that is very, very, it did not end up serving anyone's interests. Ultimately, the firms that did the later examination did ultimately say that Moonves should not, he was suing CBS to get his severance pay, which was what, like another 120 million, 125 million. Imagine the chutzpah of doing that. But they did say, no, you can't pay. But the reason I think the confidential source came forward to us was her belief that that was going to be, they were going to sweep all this under the rug, and which I think is probably true. None of this material would ever have become public if she had not leaked it.
No, and the Fox News is a really good example of this. They did a whole, internal investigation after, I can't remember if it was after Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly or just Roger Ailes, but it was a textbook example. They hire a big fancy law firm, they do a report, the report gets shoved into a drawer and nobody ever sees it.
I will also just add, there's a big board battle in the heart of the Les Moonves section where they're just like changing the rules every time they need to do anything. The corporate governance portion that you were talking about is just a bunch of made up stuff by people. It's a joke. Like people are just making up stuff to accommodate what they want to do, right? It's like we're going to have Sherry's shares converted into this weird, obscure thing. We're going to build this, that's the law. Oh, we're all going to do that. There's no, you're just people making stuff up to do whatever they want, right?
To justify the outcome that they want,
exactly.
Which often involves their own, first of all, the legal fees are enormous. This trust and estates lawyer for Sumner Redstone must have made countless millions of dollars for extremely dubious advice, which enabled the women to walk away with, what was it, like it's basically 200 million, I think it was 190.
I can't remember.
They ended up keeping for their several years of having to live with him in there. And this was a lot of this was orchestrated by supposedly his estate planning lawyer, who, by the way, the women have recommended hire. So there were conversations.
So we're gonna have one more question. Unfortunately, we just don't have time for more because the library does close at 8 and we wanna have time for book sales and signing. So here we go.
Yeah, this might be a good concluding question, James. As far as the world of journalism, I'm part of it myself to some extent right now, but I just wanted to get your opinion in the sense of, with the world of alternative facts, alternative narratives, distortions, exaggerations. Yeah, what hope do you have for real journalism still existing in the country?
I guess I'm an optimist by nature, that there seems to be a surprising willingness of people to believe what they want to believe, no matter what the facts actually say. But, all I can do, I'm just one person, and I'm trying to stick to the facts, tell the truth, not be affected by ideology. And I've made a living doing that. There are still a lot of people willing to pay something for that, and I think there's a place for that. Times as an organization, it's not perfect, but it's, I'll tell you a story. I had my nephew came to do work as a fact checker for me. He was in high school during the summer, and so I gave him and his younger brother New York Times t-shirts, and they live in Texas. So he was out on the playground, the younger brother in his Times t-shirt, and kids came over and taunted him and said, "That's the fake news, why would you be wearing that?" And so we were on vacation together, and he turned to me at breakfast, I was barely awake, and he said, "Are you the fake news?" And I was really oh my God, could we really come to this? But I didn't have a ready answer, but later I sat him down and said, "Blaine, I want to talk to you about it, and bring your brother in," because he was doing fact checking. This is not fake news. People kill themselves to be accurate. People forego, stories that are too good to check, because you can't prove them. And I still think that's a tremendous service, and at the core there is a majority of this country that appreciates that and values it.
Rachel, optimistic, pessimistic?
I'm hoping that I have a long career ahead of me, so I'm gonna go with optimism.
But it's up to you, by the way. It's not us. It's up to you to support, real journalism as opposed to this, stuff that is like fantasy.